Gentlemen, welcome to this webinar organized by Digital Enlightenment, and thanks for everybody from Digital Enlightenment for coordinating this as best as possible. The webinar will be on democracy, the COVID epidemic or pandemic, and the critical role of digital technologies. First, a little bit of practical info. I just asked everybody who is not a speaker to put yourself on mute if possible. There will be less interference that way. And I will also, for the discussion, you're welcome to ask questions or make some comments in the chat room for myself or for everybody. And then I will select some of the questions or regroup questions and comments as much as possible for the discussion time. I'm Lieve Fransen, I'm the moderator for this event. And I want first of all to thank our wonderful speakers for accepting to present their ideas and experiences today. And some of you coming from very far or connecting from very far, and some from Europe itself. I would like to give a maximum time possible to introduce the topics, for the speakers to introduce the topics, and therefore, and to give their different perspectives. And because we have really a very rich group here to present it will be also a very interesting discussion. Therefore, I plead with everybody to keep time as agreed, and if not, I will have to intervene. I will not, therefore, also introduce the speakers by presenting their very impressive CVs. Each of them has really a very amazing experience and exposure. And I invite you to look at the program and to consult their CVs as we have summarized them in the program. Yes, I think I said already at the end of the session or the webinar, I would like to ask each of the speakers to also come up maybe with one key lesson for the future, if they are still able to stay online, because I know that some of you might have some difficulties. There is also one speaker that will join us a little bit later, and but that should not disturb anybody. So as way of introduction, a very brief introduction, a crisis is often a turning point for society. And I'm convinced that the choices we make today will guide our collective future. We are facing a major societal crisis because of COVID, while the democracy is under threat in several regions since a few years, and both became interlinked. The way we deal with this virus, in global solidarity, with transparency, trusting evidence and truth, or the opposite, will dictate how we overcome this crisis and transform our society at the same time. The way we use or abuse our new technologies in this process will tell us if we go further towards putting in place totalitarian regimes or reinforce our democratic processes. As the pandemic remains a reality today, and the upcoming US elections in November challenge the democratic processes, we at Digital Enlightenment considered it the right time to analyze the situation, draw lessons for the future, and listen to all of your inputs in these areas. I'm therefore very honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Maarten Wolff. He is the chief economic commentator at the Financial Times. He was awarded the Commander of the British Empire Award for services to journalism and published a range of fascinating articles I invite you all to read. Think pieces about COVID and populism, about COVID-exposed societies, how COVID exposed societies' dysfunctions, and so on. And today he will speak on democracy will fail if we do not think like citizens. Maarten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. One of the few benefits of COVID-19 has been the way we've got used to communicating via these webinars. And I have to say, they work astonishingly well. It's not the same as being face-to-face, of course, but it is certainly much simpler and one can interact with far more people. So it's a great boon, I think, something we can build on. So I'm going to talk about why we must think as citizens. I only have about 14 more minutes, so let me go ahead. It's an enormous topic. I should say that it is the fruit of about 4 years of work on a book. I'm now on the last chapters, which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. So you can imagine I started writing it in early 2016. And I only write in the summers. It's why it's taken so long. And this is the fruit of it. So I think we are indeed at a crisis point, and we were in a crisis well before COVID-19. And I focused in this book not entirely on the way what is happening is destabilized what we thought of as consolidated democracies in the West, not just in the rest of the world. This has been referred to by one of the leading scholars of democracy in the world, Larry Diamond, as a democratic recession. I would say by now it's becoming a democratic depression. To give you some indication, just think of course, Donald Trump is still president of the United States. We had this extraordinary populist campaign over Brexit, not yet resolved. And of course, in the rest of the world, we see people like Putin, Erdogan, Modi, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Obrador, Maduro. These are leaders of very, very important countries. And of course, beyond that, we are in the world with a rising superpower, which is unquestionably autocratic, if not totalitarian. So for democracies, these are very, very serious times, very different from what we hoped and expected 30 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union finally collapsed. So why is this happening? Well, I'm going to focus, because of lack of time, just on our countries, particularly the ones I know best, Britain and America, which are pretty important countries in the history of democracy. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So I believe that an important role, not the only role, was played by economic forces. Deep divisions in our society brought about by economic forces, which interacted with cultural changes to create a very large number of despairing and angry people in our societies whom we have not been able to deal with successfully. They feel abandoned. And feeling abandoned, they have chosen to support the sorts of leaders that I think will give them nothing, but promise to give them something. Why has this happened? Well, first, we have left behind areas. There are large areas in our countries which have basically not benefited from modern economic growth. Many of them are old industrial areas. That's very clear in Britain and America, France. In Germany, interestingly, it's remarkable how much the support for the AfD is concentrated in the East. It's a similar example. And with the left behind areas are left behind people, predominantly unskilled, predominantly older, many male, but not exclusively by any means, who have seen the status and position they thought they'd enjoyed in society is gone. And with that also some very important social institutions in which they were part, I think the most important were the trades unions. Now, why did this happen? Some of it was inevitable. We've gone through a massive period of deindustrialization, and I don't think that could have been avoided. We have very powerful skill bias technological change over a period of about 4 decades. And we have globalization, which has transformed the competitiveness of industry. And I don't think, particularly the older industries, none of those things could have been prevented. But some of what happened was actually chosen. It was the result of policy choices. We have allowed the emergence of an extraordinary quantity of sophisticated rent extraction in our economic system via what I refer to as debt maximization, tax avoidance, corporate management rent extraction, decline in competition, particularly clear in the United States, and the emergence of the staggeringly powerful tech monopoly as a rent extraction machine. Second, we have introduced an extraordinary degree of labor market insecurity which one of my friends, Guy Stanley, refers to as the creation of the quote unquote, the precariat, all the people who work in casual work. We've recreated the casual work of the 19th century across a very wide part of our population. It's not a basis for family, a stable family life. And of course, this is linked with the emergence of the platform companies in the digital sector. We have associated with that a sense of the loss of the social and economic dignity of unskilled and semi-skilled work. The old labor aristocracies, as used to be referred to, have all disappeared. And that has, of course, had profound social effects. This was going on for decades. We didn't, on the whole, deal with it very well. Countries varied in how well they did, but on the whole, we didn't deal with it very well. But then we had this monstrous financial crisis, devastating consequences, in which these people who had been victims saw the financial sector saved by massive government intervention. And finally, we are also, of course, the victims of the tech industry's extraordinary capacity to disseminate lies. I can't say more about that. I've got a whole section on that in my book. So these economic failures have made it far harder to bear cultural and social change and have now had large political consequences. So what is to be done about all this? That obviously is the big challenge. And I would stress that it's really going to be very hard to deal with this. First, we have the legacy of two massive crises that have come close together. The financial crisis from which we never fully emerged, very much true in Europe, in the EU, and of course COVID-19, which we're still in the middle of. And we have no idea when we'll fully emerge, but I'm convinced it won't be for many years. We have, of course, the permanent and irretrievable loss of the West's industrial monopoly. It's not going to return. We have the looming transformations brought about by artificial intelligence and robots. We have the impact of aging on our society and the expense associated with it and the adjustments associated with it. We are clearly getting towards fiscal limits. Fiscal room for maneuver will certainly be smaller in 2025 than it has been for many, many decades, I would say, since the war. And of course, beyond all that, we have the enormous challenge of meeting the climate crisis, and sustaining prosperity with that. Now, I've been thinking a lot about what our goals should be in this, and then I'll have to close. There's so much more to be said. And in thinking about this, I decided to go back to one of the most famous speeches delivered by any Democratic politician, and in my view, clearly the most important Democratic politician, arguably the most important politician, but clearly the most important Democratic politician of the 20th century. And no, I don't mean Winston Churchill, I mean Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In January 1941, so when he was clear that America was going to enter the war, but it was not yet in the war, he delivered a speech, which I've just reread, in fact, on the four freedoms, which was the watchword for the future world. It was his expression of America's goals for the future world. And it has two parts, which I think both are incredibly relevant to us. The first part describes the domestic commitments of America, what he believed America had to do at home. And here I quote, "The basic things expected by our people of their political and economic simples are simple. They are equality of opportunity, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it, the ending of special privileges for the few," and I've just listed a lot of them above. I go back to the quotation, "the preservation of civil liberties for all, the enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living." Now, we today would, of course, add more on equality of all citizens, and we would emphasize, of course, that this growth of which he spoke had to be inclusive and it has to be sustainable. But beyond that, I think those descriptions of our objectives remain absolutely real. And they did a marvelous job after the war in achieving this. And in the last 30 or 40 years, we have done much less well. And finally, that was the first part of his speech, which was about, as I said, was about the domestic priorities. But he also made clear that his concept of citizenship, what I've just described, is his concept of the citizen as part of a democratic society. He also was quite clear that it had to be a global community. And that's why the speech is called the speech of the four freedoms. And the four freedoms, of course, are freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And those are pretty radical ideas even now. And we have, God knows, failed to deliver them. So my view is that we need to go back to the way the most far-sighted people were thinking in the middle of the 20th century, bring it up to date fully for our today, realize how far we have fallen short, rectify what we can, add what we clearly must, and I've already indicated some of these things. It's going to be very hard, as I've indicated, and there are many topics I haven't been able to cover, but I think we have no alternative but to try. We have to do better, because if we continue as we are, in my view, admittedly, this may be the thinking of somebody in their mid-70s who's getting pretty frightened in his old age, but if we fail to do this, I'm not clear that our civilization or our world will survive as we would like it to be. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm impressed how you kept it short. You kept it shorter than I gave you the time. So
I thought I was exactly on time. I try as a journalist to be absolutely on time, and you gave me 15 minutes, and I think that's how long I talk.
I'm sure that a lot of people would like to intervene or like to ask you further questions, but maybe I would like to give one, as we have two more minutes within your time. I would like Paul or George from Digital Enlightenment. Do you want to make a comment or you want to come in?
Yeah, if I may, Lieve, just quickly jumping in. I'm always wondering, why did we not see it coming, or did we not see it coming? And what does that tell us about how we have to think and act and work differently?
Let me complement this, Lieve, if you allow me. And,
yes.
Thank you again for moderating this event. The speaker mentioned the impact of economic forces. Now, what happened in the wake of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, with all the impacts that Mr. Wolf outlined so well, is that there was a long period of adjustment to the new realities, by the winners and the losers. Now, these adjustments included colonization, a couple of world wars, Nazism, Stalinism. Now we are all advertising the great digital revolution. Can we hope that we can make the adjustment and the transition a bit less horribly than happened last time?
Okay, Martin.
Can I comment very briefly?
Yes.
I think we're very bad at seeing things coming. Certainly, that's been true for me in important respects, not all respects, but in important respects. And I think the most important failure I had until about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, was the failure to realize how fragile the political underpinnings of our system had become, what you might call the legitimacy underpinnings of our system. And the reason for that is, I think, in my case, I was blinded by the failure of Soviet communism, and I thought our system was fundamentally more robust. And that's a very, very serious failure. The wider failure is most economists don't think about politics, and most politicians don't think enough about economics. And it's very difficult to get people to think about them all together, everything together. It's really hard to think about everything together. And to answer George, that's exactly what I'm frightened of. This is part of my book, and my first book on globalization was about this. What is sometimes called the first globalization, which is an era of great technological transformation, which is essentially most of the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, ended up in 2 world wars and the communist revolution of 1917. And we would have to say something very, very simple. We cannot repeat that exercise, because if we repeat that exercise, it'll be the end of us, literally. This is not metaphorically, it will be nuclear. So it is absolutely clear we cannot repeat the mistakes of our great-grandparents and grandparents, and we aren't that far from it. Just look at what's happening in US-China relations at the moment, which in my view is a byproduct in significant measure of these disasters. So his description is absolutely correct. The risk is absolutely real. It's a central part of my argument, but it is not something we can possibly do. So we have to find another way.
Thank you very much, Martin. This is, of course, too short to really, but I hope that you can still come back at the end of the discussion. And maybe part of it is also that we politicians have politics thinks very short term, and the financial crisis made us think even more short term. And we've lost the longer term view and historic perspective. And I'm thanking you very much for bringing that larger picture back in our discussion here and in our reflections. Thank you. And I would like to go to the next speaker, the wonderful speaker of Tom Gerald Daly, who is joining us from Melbourne. And he's a constitutional lawyer with a wide-ranging and global expertise. He will speak about democracy and COVID worldwide, digital threats and solutions. I asked Tom to address the following 2 questions in his introduction. Could you provide us with a brief overview of the threats and the challenges encountered during COVID-19 epidemic and highlight the role of digital technologies in this? I'm thinking, of course, of fake news, propaganda, politicization and distortion of scientific information, and the adoption of restrictive laws by some states, sometimes introduced like a Trojan horse and later on not again dropped. The second question I asked Tom to respond to is, while you highlight a lot of dark challenges, would you be able to share with us some hopeful examples of places where digital technologies have reinforced the democratic processes, even during COVID-19? Here, I'm thinking about Taiwan, Scotland, grassroots experiences that have influenced state authorities to change or to act in the right direction. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lieve. I hope I do answer some of your questions. And thank you to Digital Enlightenment for the invitation. It's really great actually to have the opportunity to think a bit more systematically about the way digital threats to democracy have intensified during the pandemic, but also how we've seen a lot of signs of hope. And I should say from the outset that in my short presentation, I'm drawing heavily on policy and academic analysis gathered through the COVID DEM project I launched in April 2020 to chart the pandemic's impact on democracy worldwide. And this is part of a broader project on democratic decay and renewal. So COVID DEM is a free online database. It provides access to thousands of carefully curated items. But really, thinking about the pandemic, from the moment it hit, it felt for me as though 2 possible versions of our future had come into sharper focus. So on one side, we see this worrying future of normalized surveillance, even totalitarianism, as Martin said, intensifying disinformation, disempowered individuals, and increasing opportunism by the enemies of democracy, both inside and outside the state. But when you look more closely, there's another story too, one about agency, solidarity, and innovation through digital technology, which has enormous potential to reinvigorate and update how we practice democracy and make it more resilient and inclusive. So I can't be anything like comprehensive. So in my short time, I just want to give you an impressionistic account of some of the main trends globally. So 5 minutes on the bad and 5 minutes on the good. So to start with the bad, of course, one of the most immediate concerns has been the expansion of government surveillance as part of virus suppression measures, especially through the use of tracking apps for contact tracing, and sometimes employing technology actually developed by the security services, as seen in Israel. And a range of serious concerns have been voiced. In some cases, surveillance technology has been used by the state without either the consent or knowledge of individuals, and we've seen that in Bulgaria, or without any degree of judicial or political oversight, as seen in Croatia. And while use of these apps is voluntary in many states, like the UK or Australia, it's mandatory in others, like India. So obviously one of the central issues is individuals' privacy. But there's a broader worry centered on the normalization of surveillance itself, that what is supposed to be exceptional in a democracy and subject to rigorous safeguards is becoming routine and unconstrained. But it's not just about governments as well. As early as April, the WHO began warning about an infodemic of rumors, fake news, and messages of hate and division centered on the pandemic. And this, of course, is just the latest iteration of an intensifying trend in recent years of political forces seeking to delegitimize the authority of science and objective facts, to scapegoat minorities for political advantage, and fragment any sense of a shared public sphere or shared truth. So we see, radical right groups have pounced on the pandemic to try and grow their support. The far-right group Pegida in Germany organized weekly virtual marches, live streamed on YouTube, seeking to replicate as far as possible their offline marches. And they've also modified their anti-democratic and anti-Islam messages for the COVID era, for example, by blaming Muslim communities for failing to comply with physical distancing. And even in my home country, Ireland, where the extreme right had made little political headway by European standards, far-right groups have started using the Telegram app widely to tap into discontent under the lockdown, again in an effort to grow their support. And it's been successful to the extent that Europol actually voiced concern over their growing influence in June. And of course, we've seen the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories has accelerated in countries from the UK to the USA during the crisis, with QAnon, for example, featuring prominently. And this disinformation challenge itself has created an opening for undemocratic governments to engage in wider censorship under the guise of combating disinformation. So the Singaporean government, for example, has been using an existing law, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, to remove critical views about the country's COVID-19 response online. And we see similar reports in Indonesia with digital hacking of critical websites. In Kenya, the state has been using legal threats and arrests under the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act 2018 to intimidate whistleblowers and critics. In Hungary, again, you have this controversial new law criminalizing the publication of false or distorted facts, introduced in March. But the law hasn't been used as much as other subtler delegitimizing tactics. So you have, for example, the public broadcaster's news program Hirado established an online fake news monitor on its website to ostensibly debunk false statements about the pandemic. But again, the main targets have been opposition politicians and articles critical of the government. And that's why, as a Brazil scholar, I've been paying close attention to the fake news bill passed by the Brazilian Senate in July, because key concerns raised have included that it's ambiguous and overly broad, that key provisions are open to political abuse, including provisions requiring social media platforms to monitor users' identities and to track and store chains of forwarded communications. The bill also makes social platforms responsible for everything published on them. So that could lead to really aggressive censorship by the platforms themselves. And then, of course, there's a whole international dimension to all of this, in the sense that authoritarian governments have cranked up their propaganda during COVID with, what some democracy analysts call sharp power. So the European Commission issued a report in June concluding that Russia and China were the primary agents rolling out these targeted disinformation campaigns, and I quote, seeking to undermine democratic debate and exacerbate social polarization and improve their own image in the COVID-19 context. So here in Australia, a week after that report, the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, she caused quite a stir when she made a speech criticising these disinformation campaigns, although she didn't target any government by name. And shortly afterwards, the government announced it's going to spend $15 billion on developing its cyber and information warfare capabilities over the next 10 years. So you get this picture of an increasingly harsh national and international climate where digital technology is being weaponized in all sorts of ways, both to chip away at democracy and to protect it from external attack. But as I said at the start, that's only half the story, and there are many positive uses of digital technology during the pandemic too, and I just want to canvass a few of them. So Lieve mentioned Taiwan, and perhaps one of the leading examples has been Taiwan's use of civic tech hacktivists, building on the open source, open government focus of existing movements, the movement G0V.gov and the Sunflower Student Protest movement. So Taiwan has kept its cases to just over 500, but unlike the centralized top-down approach in many other states, which has raised concerns, they've detected and responded to COVID through crowdsourced information gathered through online bulletin boards. And similarly, the digital minister, Audrey Tang, spearheaded a humour over rumour strategy, as it was called, that has successfully addressed misinformation, fake news and disinformation through memes shared on social media. And there's been this sort of similar inventiveness in South Korea around elections. Korea was one of the first countries to organize national elections under pandemic conditions, and candidates made an unprecedented shift to the use of digital and online technology, primarily by sharing videos on social media, using text messages, smartphone apps, and even embracing augmented reality technology in some cases. And they actually got the highest voter turnout since 1992, 66% of eligible voters. You see the similar story with Mongolia's July elections, candidates making imaginative use of social media, even using social media influencers to get their message across. And the local elections here in Victoria right now, we've seen more women and minority candidates than expected. They're spurred on by the COVID experience to make a difference, but they're also making use of online campaigning to level the playing field as much as they can with establishment politicians. And government institutions have also been transformed during the pandemic. Digital parliaments are a key example. So I found it very striking that the UK Parliament was so willing to rethink how the Parliament works, despite being so steeped in tradition. So on the 22nd of April, the House of Commons actually made history when a new hybrid system mixing in-person and remote attendance was trialled for the first time. And in mid-May, the first votes were cast from across the country. Now, that's not to say there haven't been problems, but some interesting findings from preliminary research are already coming out, showing less booing and jeering during Prime Minister's questions, greater focus on the substance of debates, MPs being able to spend more time in their constituencies, and more contributions from female MPs. And that sort of thinking has also allowed citizens' assemblies to continue operating like the Assembly on Scotland's constitutional future. In my last sort of 2 minutes, I'll just say beyond formal institutions, there's been an explosion of creativity at grassroots level. So in India, the parliament has been basically silenced for months on end during COVID, but grassroots pushback has included an online people's parliament. It's called the Janta Parliament, organised by civil rights organisations during August as an alternative forum for deliberation about a range of issues like health, economic, labour and rights issues arising from the pandemic. We've seen creative digital activism employed to push back against state repression of human rights monitors in states like the Philippines. There have been calls to establish a central fact-checking website in Hungary to combat the government's domination of the media landscape and distortion of facts. We're seeing the creation of cooperative citizens media organisations at local level in the UK. The Global Civic Engagement Index has indicated an increase of 81% of people joining or signing online petitions this year, and there's been a particularly significant increase in online activism in South Africa. So overall, I suppose my point is, if we're looking at two different futures, one negative and the other positive, the future really isn't decided yet, and there are different pieces of the potentially positive future so many of us want to see are being trialed and built right now all around us in states and communities across the world. So it's really a question of making the most of it and trying to build on that, I think, for the future. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tom. Very fascinating. I'm very happy that you went from the bad to the positive and the creativity. Where I would like to push this a bit further, of course. And as the future is not decided, what is it that we can do more to influence it one way or another? But we will have to come back to the discussion for that. Because I would like to have Nuria Oliver now, and I think she has similar or maybe different experiences. She's an amazing computer and data scientist, and she holds a PhD from the MIT and received many honors worldwide. Today, she's leading a team of 20 data scientists applied to confront COVID-19. And she will speak about the lessons learned about participation, privacy, and contact tracing. Nuria, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So the topic of this session is on participation and democracy and COVID-19. And I think the first important observation is that an infectious disease that is transmitted from human to human requires human participation for it to become a pandemic. So we are all participating both as agents and subjects, in the COVID-19 pandemic. However, and as it has already been mentioned before, the pandemic has brought to the surface long-standing and deeply rooted structural fault lines in our world. And it hasn't affected everyone homogeneously, but it has shown the differential effects depending on the socioeconomic status of people, their racial and ethnic origin, their sex, their disabilities, their migrant situation, and so forth. So some authors even refer to the COVID-19 pandemic as a syndemic, which would be sort of like a health issue that clusters along different social lines. In this context, I'm a great believer that data and technology are critical to help us not only fight the COVID-19 pandemic, but also build a better world. But what has also been evident is that this is not going to happen naturally if we don't actually act on it with clear guiding principles and methods. So with this vision of how we could help here in Spain, particularly the Valencian government, which is the region in Spain located at the east of the country by the Mediterranean Sea. In March 2020, I was named commissioner to the president of the region to work on AI and data science against COVID-19. So I created a team of 20 plus scientists from the Valencian region universities and research centers, and we've been working non-stop since March on how, with expert knowledge and data science, we could help assist public policy decision making. So the decisions wouldn't be based on intuitions or fake information or self-interests, but they would actually be based on scientific knowledge and evidence. We've been working on 4 areas, which are, the first one is human mobility analysis. So through a collaboration with the Spanish National Office of Statistics, we were able to access large-scale anonymized mobility data to help us understand if the confinement measures that were deployed actually worked, if people did reduce their mobility or not, and what type of mobility was reduced, but also what impact did those confinements had on the spread of the disease. So the second team has been working on building computational epidemiological models that enable us not only to predict how the pandemic might be evolving, but also what would happen under different scenarios of mobility or of contact tracing, or for example, percentages of susceptible population, because we know that not everyone is susceptible actually to getting COVID-19. The third team is working on predictive models. We are predicting how many intensive care units will be needed, how many hospitalizations we expect that there will be, but also we inferred, for example, the prevalence of the disease back in April when there was no seroprevalence study, and that was extremely helpful to determine whether there would be a second wave or not, which we knew there would be a second wave because we were very far away from having herd immunity. And then the last initiative, which I think resonates a lot with the theme in this session, is a citizen science initiative. So in March 28th, 2020, we launched a really large-scale citizen survey called COVID-19 Impact Survey, which has become one of the largest in Europe regarding COVID-19, with over 300,000 answers. It is an anonymous survey. It only has 25 questions. It only takes 5 minutes to respond it. And we've been analyzing the data weekly. And the answers to the survey have become incredibly useful to understand the situation and the perception of people during the pandemic. So, for example, thanks to the survey, we learned that there were no tests at the beginning of the pandemic, but there are plenty of availability of tests right now. A very small percentage of people say that they would like to be tested, but they can't. We learned that over 70% of people report that the pandemic has had a severe psychological impact on them. And we find that the youth and women are the 2 demographic groups that are the most psychologically impacted. Age-wise, the youth, 18 to 29-year-old people, are the ones that report the highest psychological impact, the highest levels of stress, of anxiety, of loneliness, and of sadness when compared to any other groups. Also, the largest abusive use of technology, drugs, and alcohol. But among the youth, it is women, and in general, in all the age groups, it is women, the ones that report the highest psychological impact. We've also learned that only 48% of people report that they would be able to self-isolate if they had to. So the main goal of the TTI strategy is trace to know whom to test, to know whom to isolate, requires people to effectively put themselves in quarantine. And we find that a very significant percentage of the population is not able to quarantine or self-isolate because of a variety of reasons. The most important one is because of sharing the home, living in a small home with other people, also having to take care of others. And there we find a very significant sex differential impact, where I think it's like more than twice, it's 32% versus 15% of men versus women age 30 to 59 report that they wouldn't be able to self-isolate because of taking care of children. So we find a very significant impact on women. And then we have around 15% reporting psychological reasons, stigmatization, and psychologically not being able to endure isolation for any longer. Stigmatization has more than doubled since the beginning of the pandemic, and it is the highest among the youth. And then we have labor and economic reasons. A lot of people reporting, around 15% in total, that they wouldn't be able to self-isolate because they couldn't afford it. If they don't work, they don't make any money and they can't eat. So they go to work even if they feel sick. We've also learned that in Spain, 89% of the people report wearing a mask, but we know that that percentage is much lower in indoor environments. We've learned that around 50% of people think that going to the hospital is safe. That's a very low percentage. A lot of people don't go to the hospital because they're scared of COVID-19, even if they should go. And that percentage is even lower for schools. Only 32% of people think that going to school is safe in terms of the risk of getting COVID-19. So through this survey, we've been learning a lot of important information in terms of the situation and the perception, of people. What have we learned? So I have learned many things. One of the first things that I've learned is that the public administration, at least in Spain, is not digital. And we need a tremendous reform of the decision makers and the public administration so they actually become digital. I've learned that when I asked for data back in March, we are the data science team, so without data, we can't do any science. What they would send me is a PDF with a table. And I'll be like, but this is not data, this is a PDF with a table. So they did not really understand what even data meant. I've learned that that having access to reliable, high quality, systematically captured data is absolutely key to be able to understand the underlying reality that this data is capturing. I've also learned that it's very important to understand the limitations of the data. Not everyone is accounted for. Not everything is captured by the data. So while it is very important because it is a window into reality, we also understand that it's a narrow window into reality. And that's also very important to know. I've learned that we do need to invest a lot on human resources, definitely, certain numbers of contact tracers and teachers and doctors and nurses. But I've also learned that they need to have the necessary tools to be able to do their job in an efficient way. And I've learned that many of them don't have the technological savviness to be able to do it. We can have a lot of contact tracers, but if they're using tools from the 70s and it takes them half an hour to enter every case, it's not going to work very well. So having data, people, and technology seamlessly working together, I think is absolutely necessary. I've also learned that the reason why we do this is to guide policy making. So we have to be able to close the loop. We have to be able to design on the fly policies and processes that are tackling the weaknesses that we are discovering through this process of data analysis. For example, if we know that only 48% of people can self-isolate, and we understand why, and we understand the demographic groups and the reasons why they cannot self-isolate, let's design programs that will help them do an effective quarantine. Let's minimize the burden on people to be able to do quarantine. If we know that the youth are the most psychologically impacted by the pandemic, what are we doing to support them? What are we doing to give them an optimistic view of the future so that they feel that we are not stealing, the future from them? If we know that the disease affects very differently different demographic groups, and we know that there are certain very vulnerable demographic groups like the elderly or people with risk factors or the social healthcare sort of like personnel, what are we doing to protect them? If we make sure that they don't get the disease, the impact on the healthcare system will be very much smaller, right? We know that people are afraid of going to the hospital. With the medical burden that this entails, a lot of people going too late and then being much more costly in terms of human lives and also economically. What are we doing to efficiently communicate to people that it's safe to go to the hospital and so forth? So I think finding this virtuous cycle between data, technology, people, and then policymaking and processes is absolutely necessary, not only to be able to tackle this pandemic, but also to move towards this vision of having more evidence-driven, more science-driven policy making through the analysis of the data.
Thank you very much, Nuria. Very informative. One question from the audience is John Beckett asking if this is valid, if your study is specifically for Valencia or is it also for Spain and Europe in general? So maybe you can briefly answer that question. But
so
there's also another comment that I mean, you seem to trust people's answers very much, that they cannot self-isolate. But we have also experience of people that can, but don't want to self-isolate and put society or their surroundings at risk. How do you make that difference there?
Yeah, so the first answer on the geographic coverage of the work, it depends on the line of work. So the mobility analysis, we were named the pilot region in Spain by the Ministry of Economics. So we analyze the mobility only for the Valencian region. So all the mobility work has been done for the Valencian region. The epidemiological models, because they also use the mobility, they've also been done for the Valencian region, but the methodologies apply to any other region. The predictive models also we've done them for the Valencian region, but the methods we are using apply to any other region. And the citizen survey is international. So we have over 280,000 answers from Spain collected over 28 weeks. And we are still collecting every week. And then we have another, I think it's 50,000 answers from other countries in the world, namely Brazil, Germany, Italy, Colombia, Mexico. And we've actually been analyzing in the past few weeks Germany, Spain, Italy, trying to shed light as to why Spain was doing so badly compared to Italy and Germany. And I have to say that we haven't found any evidence on significantly different behaviors. We don't find any evidence on the German respondents or the Italian respondents being more socially distant or taking more protective measures or being more compliant with, the recommendations than the Spanish people. So we are still kind of intrigued by this phenomenon, and we think that coronavirus being a high dispersion virus, which means that the spread is not homogeneous across all infected individuals, but there are certain individuals that if they are in the right environment from a spreading perspective, meaning an indoor environment with high density of people over a sustained amount of time, then they infect a lot of people. So there is this high infection events that happen. So we think that maybe the public policies and the control over those high spreading events might be different in the different countries, and that might be one of the reasons. In terms of the using a population survey that is self-reported to assess the state of an underlying reality and the risk that people might answer untruthful answers, yes, this is possible. The survey is voluntary, and we rely on people's goodwill to answer truthful answers. We have very high numbers, and we contrasted the answers of the first week via 2 different professional polls, just precisely to determine if there were any biases or there was a lot of noise in the answers. And we actually got results that were totally aligned with the polls. We have also developed some provisions to eliminate answers that seem to be not good answers, either because they have contradictions in them. For example, they say that they don't have children, but then they say they live with children, or they say that they are whatever age, but then they say something else. And also answers that are answered too fast. Like there is a median amount of time that it takes to answer the survey, say 5 minutes. So if someone answers the survey like in 1 minute, we discard those kinds of answers as well. I think citizen participation is very important, and depending on the country, I think it has been one of the lacking elements. As I said at the beginning, the pandemic is a pandemic because we all participate in it, but we have not been active participants, neither in the decision making nor in the sort of like contribution to finding solutions. And I think that has been from my perspective, a great weakness, the lack of engagement, positive and active engagement of civil society in this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Nuria. We don't have further time, but of course, there's a key question also in how far policy is based on evidence, or is politics is influencing or guiding the evidence. But we'll come back in the discussion probably, because I would really like to go back to the next speaker, who is Mr. Wieslaw Bartkowski. He's working at University of Warsaw in Poland, and he's the head of co-founder of Creative Coding. He's exploring the boundaries between art, design, science, and technology in an anti-disciplinary way. He will speak on towards healthy digital technology. And I asked him two questions. From your varied experience and interest, you look at the two sides of technology and come to the conclusion that the divide between the humanistic and scientific mind is not black and white. Digital technologies clearly have an impact on people's minds, behaviors, and brains. And could you share with us how this is impacting our democracy? The second question I asked you is, you recommend the redesign technologies starting from the values we want in society and not from the technologies as it is done now. Tell us about your experiences, experiments, and examples that are empowering and go into the direction in that direction, in your opinion. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Wieslaw.
Okay, welcome. Thank you for the invitation. I try to answer this question maybe in more abstract way, both questions. Of course, I will not talk about addiction to the technology, because it is obvious that when we have addicted society, this society not work well, also in democratic terms. So to design healthy tech is starting from the values for me, not shifting responsibility to individuals, or arguing like it is argued in some movies, like the last movie Social Dilemma, for example. So patches holes or shifting responsibility to people is not an answer to this question. And we have to remember what brilliantly Neil Postman said, that every technology for sure give us something, but also taking something away from us. So I think we talk too little about this side of taking away, and to what is taken away. It's very important to understand in which way and what is taken away. So I think that because the brain plasticity is now obvious. We know from research that brain is plastic during our life. All our life is kind of is changing during by the stimuli. So because of this brain plasticity, we became extension of our tools. So for example, if you have a hammer in your hand, you start to think with the hammer. If you have digital technology, you start to be also an extension of this digital technology. You merge with this technology, so it changes you. You can say that first we program computers, and after they program us. So that's why it is so important to ask the question according to which values we shape technology, and especially technologies which are intellect technologies. And now intellect technologies are mostly digital technologies. So the question is mostly today how we shape digital technology. And we have also to remember that technology is not ethically neutral. It carries the values of its creator. And these values today are mostly driven by corporate capitalism operating system, you can say. So this operating system which drive it It's also drive all the decisions which are made about what kind of technology and what features of technology we develop mostly. And it's very common in this kind of corporation that engineers and even scientists and other people involving in this process, also some of my students at the computer science department, where I teach at the University Warsaw, but also teach at private university, SWPS University, which is my first place. There I teach psychologists, artists, and designers. So I have views from those two perspectives. And this computer science student used to say that people are the problem and technology is the solution to the problem. So we have to make software which is resistant to the human factors. So people are the problem for them. So I try to teach them it takes time to start think differently about human being and not in the way of the problem and the solution by technology. So putting more technology is not a solution to this problem. And we also have to understand that digitalization means reduction, because we are taught, and there is a lot about this, if something is digital, it's perfect. There is no noise, there is no distortion, and it lasts for long this way. It's not true, because every digitalization is kind of reduction of the complexity of the world around us. And for example, it is now mostly reduction people to numbers and calculation. So if we believe in numbers and calculation, we miss something. So, and this reduction have a side effects. I think this side effects is erosion of humanities and humanness. And this is very important, because this way that this digital technology start work and influence us make that we don't have a kind of calm, attentive mind, which is important to have for deep thinking, but also for compassion, empathy, and sensitivity to the complexity of our reality. So it's very important to understand how these neural processes work. For example, it's worth to see the work of Professor Damasio, who discovered that the higher emotion emerged from neural processes which are inherently slow. But where we are connected to digital technology, we just start to work more as digital, more as robots, less like human beings. So we have no time to think this way. We have no time to think slowly, because we have to respond in digital manner. So we have to respond very quickly. We have no time to think it out. And most social media works this way. There is no time to think it out. You have to respond now at the moment. And another thing is what Heidegger said, that calculative thinking is winning because of developing new technologies, winning with a meditative way of thinking. So, and the human thinking is identified, equal calculation. So we start to think about human thinking like another computation or calculation. So we start to view man more as a machine, less as a human being this way. So I think it's very important to say what is really more human, what is really human about us. And I think it is what is really human is it is something which is least computable about us. So this what is hard to digitize and computate is really really in the heart of the human being, and this is the value we have to protect, because Yeah, because we start to believe that that the technology is the solution, but technology can bring only comfort to our life, but technology can't bring fulfillment or good life. So this divide of these values is well shown in this quote. So technology is about comfort, but technology is not about fulfillment or good life. So we have to remember this designing technology and choosing, because this is time to reverse the question about automation. We have to ask what not to automate. This is the main, very important question.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very good last sentence, and I hope we can come back to a lot of this during the discussion, but and hopefully next sessions, because we open a lot of Pandora's boxes here.
I have some example of the project which works like this. So maybe
because we've gone over time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Maybe during the discussion you can bring that, because I would like to introduce the next speaker. The last speaker is Seda Gürses. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leuven and at the Technical University of Delft, and she will speak about privacy by design as infrastructural power. She's focusing on the intersection between social justice and computer science. And I asked her the following questions. Could you share with us some lessons about the role of infrastructural power and explain this? How this has been taken into account by authorities and states while preparing apps and surveillance tools to confront COVID-19? Could you share with us why the value of data and algorithms have been recognized and maybe overemphasized, but the role of infrastructure has not, and why does it matter? And as a consequence of this, can you point us towards a blind spot with great geopolitical consequences? Could you make some recommendations for Europe on how to tackle this? Seda, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lieve, and great to see everybody here. I just want to extend a big thank you to Lieve, who called every one of us personally before this event to have these questions prepared so that we complement each other. And listening to all the other speakers, I have to say the complementarity is there. It's wonderful. Thank you, Lieve. So I will answer the question in a kind of narrative way. I will talk about what happened to me and projects I was part of over the last 6 months. Specifically, I was part of one of the proposals for contact tracing apps with colleagues under the leadership of EPFL and other universities. We developed a privacy-preserving design for contact tracing. This was called DP3T. I can tell you what the acronym stands for after the talk. You may have heard of Corona Melder in the case of Netherlands, the design of which is based on DP3T, somewhere down the line. Now, the design of DP3T was in congruence with similar designs developed by groups of cryptographers and epidemiologists across the world. So there were a lot of researchers in the US and elsewhere who came up with similar designs. So it was like a moment of convergence between scientists. There was not one design, there were multiple, and there were some nuances and differences between them that were really important. But DP3T, which was at that point and still is under the leadership of Professor Carmela Troncoso, was maybe by virtue of having made itself public before, all of the developments were behind closed doors until then, was then the one that was used by Google and Apple for what became known as Google Apple exposure notification. So if you have the Corona Melder today, or if you have a Corona app in Germany, Switzerland, and a few other countries, then your app is based on this Google Apple exposure notification, which was inspired by DP3T. I do not want to talk about the merits or weaknesses of the design, which is, I think, an interesting topic, but not for today. I want to take a step back and tease out how we got to DP3T and then how we got to GAIN, the Google Apple, I shorten them as GAPL, exposure notification. The point I want to talk about is how, counterintuitively, privacy, something we cherish a lot, I've been working on it for 15 years, became a stepping stone for large technology companies to center their services and expand their power. Now, the contact tracing apps were initiated by governments, probably prematurely, without thinking of the full consequences. I say prematurely because governments proposed to direct their whole population towards tech companies in a historical moment when tech companies are gearing up their infrastructure to optimize population management. Similar to how these companies made their money capturing ad budgets across the globe or through selling us rather expensive phones, now they intend to expand their institutions and infrastructures by taking over or capturing the budgets of public institutions and infrastructures. This includes the health authorities. So in a few minutes, I'll try to demonstrate how this played out over the last 7 months. When we set out to design and publish DP3T, we did so assuming that the said governments and civil society would have a say over the journey of this application. We assumed that the governments and civil society would determine the design, the deployment, duration of deployment, and setup of extra structures, non-technical, societal, and institutional structures to respond to risks, harms, and unexpected results. We knew as soon as the government said, we want apps, there was no way of avoiding Google and Apple as intermediaries. An app, in common lingo, refers to those applications that typically run on mobile phones, 99% of which today either run iOS by Apple or Android by Google. The deployment of the app would require the cooperation of the two companies for a number of things. For example, to prevent abuse by other app providers posing as if they are the contact tracing app and collecting lots of data, or deploying the system so that the two types of phones, Google phones and Apple phones, could talk with each other when they exchange Bluetooth messages. But maybe most importantly, this decision to use Bluetooth in contact tracing apps, which was not the only option available, but that's another question, required Apple and Google, and especially Apple, to make changes to their operating system that would allow app developers to access the Bluetooth low energy APIs. Now, I said a lot of technical things. Operating system is what allows you to run anything on your phone. It needs to be on there so that your applications can speak with the hardware. And these are usually proprietary in one way or another. And the one from Apple is called iOS, and the one from Google is called Android. So in order to make these apps that use Bluetooth in a way that wouldn't consume the battery of the users, meaning people would probably uninstall their apps, the developers had to have access to low energy Bluetooth API. This meant that Apple had to change their operating system, and this was the moment that they leveraged their power. When Google and Apple came into the picture, they introduced two phases. Phase one would provide access to developers for the Bluetooth API and ensure interoperability. Phase two would implement contact tracing in the operating system of Apple and in a native app in the case of Android. So what this means is instead of having the Corona melder, the functionality for contact tracing would be on your phone when you buy it, when you unpack it, or when you update it. So when Google and Apple came into the picture, they saw this as an opportunity for multiple things, including building direct relationships with governments and health authorities across the world. This move and the decision to make contact tracing a native functionality to the operating system or a native app had great impact. First of all, the two companies could now push the functionality necessary for contact tracing, even if it's privacy preserving, onto all the phones under their control. So this meant that now you didn't have to decide to install an app, but if you updated your phone, you now had the functionality, if it was the right version, but we don't need to go into the details. The fact that they could push the functionality removed the possibility for individuals to install and delete an app. The contact with health authorities allowed them, for example, to introduce themselves in the US as the arbiter between states that are unable to coordinate local or federal apps. This put them as a company as an inevitable player in matters of public health. By going native to the operating system, they removed the possibility of transparency and oversight by government and civil society. In particular, they removed the possibility to sunset the functionality, making it a matter at the discretion of the two companies to say, well, the last global user has stopped using it, now we can maybe remove it out of our operating system. They further removed the possibility to do scientific research on the data, although the scientific value of Bluetooth proximity data is limited. And in fact, this limitation goes for all location data that we get from tech companies, which is production data and not health data. So the Google and Apples of this world show that they are gatekeepers in what kind of research is done and by whom. This means that if national health authorities now want to collaborate and think about the impact of these apps on their populations or work on the Bluetooth application, they will have to find collaboration with Google and Apple. Finally, and maybe very importantly, Google and Apple normalized the idea that they could leverage the operating system for functionality they deem central to their bottom line, to their business. So this could have an impact also on future potential markets where market players will not be able to compete because the functionality is in the operating system and may be blocked on the App Store. So how can we tell the story so that we can learn from the current condition we are in and learn from the challenges that these bring to not just individuals, but to maintaining democratic institutions and processes? I'd like to highlight that what Gapple showed to us is that contact tracing apps is that they have infrastructural power. What do I mean by that? They already have a computational infrastructure that is rolled out, that we carry around in our pockets, and that rely on their cloud systems. This infrastructure is currently faster, more scalable, and less costly than any other infrastructure we can imagine rolling out. And it is already integrated into our lives. So imagine the alternative. If we had Bluetooth dongles that the government gave out, we would have to roll it out, make sure their usability, make sure people don't leave them at home. Most people will take their phones with them. Most importantly, the companies were happy to forego access to data in return for both exercising and expanding their infrastructural power. They didn't care to get population data. They did not want to crunch numbers and do data analytics. They wanted to expand their infrastructure into public health. What we see here is that privacy does not function to keep power asymmetries at bay, as we try to do with our privacy by design. This is what we're taught. If we can keep the data from a centralized authority, they cannot abuse their power with this data. But instead, Google and Apple use privacy to position themselves between citizens and their governments. They said, we will protect your privacy better than your governments. They used it to expand their power. Privacy became a way to exercise their infrastructural power. So that's my first point, I think. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned, because if I said there is infrastructural power 6 months ago, most people would not understand. But now I can tell you the story. So that's the upside of the story. But there's one more point I want to make. One of the reasons that a member of the Digital Enlightenment community asked me to join is that I talk about another paper that I wrote with the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest. We wrote this paper on extractivism inherent to contact tracing apps. When we look at technology, we do injustice by looking at how it is used and not how it is produced. We are and should be aware that while we propose to use apps to bring people health, the production of these technologies require using phones, and the production of these phones are associated with extractivist supply chains. These produce grave human and environmental harms. I'm here referring to the mines in Africa and South America, the associated supply chains and their power moves geopolitically, and the factories in East Asia, where working conditions have been substandard. Somehow, the tech industry has managed to keep us looking at the screen, reflecting on news, and not thinking about the extractive supply chains and the harmful conditions they normalize. A big question remains whose health we are promoting when we're promoting the use of apps and phones. And what claims to democracy or citizenship can we make if this means our citizenship comes at the cost of others' lives? Thank you.
I think you're muted. You have to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, I can't hear. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Seda. I learned a lot in our previous conversation in preparing this, and I hope everybody valued this also very much. And luckily, we don't have very much time, but I just went through the questions. A lot of, and thanks to Nuria and some of the others to have replied already to the questions in the chat room. So that's, and to share some of the data information. There's one question that goes specifically to Martin, and that's from George. It's related to Hariri's recent presentation, and it basically highlights the danger of data colonization. Martin, do you feel you are ready to respond to that? I'm sure you're aware of the statements made by Hariri.
Well, I've actually answered this privately, but I'm happy to.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't see.
But no, I'm happy to give my indication of this.
Okay.
I come at the question that most of you are expert on from outside. Namely, I'm interested in global economics and global politics, and obviously digital technology is an essential part of this. But I am professionally non-expert, of course. I try not to write about things I feel I'm not expert about. So I've written very little about this, but I've written a few things, and it's part of my book. But so that allows me to give a very, very brief answer to this. I don't know exactly what Yuval was referring to, but I have moved in the last few years from being very concerned about the power of the platforms, which I've mentioned in my talk, to this specific issue of the meaning of national sovereignty. And I have come to the view, which is not a view I had a year or two ago, because I didn't think about it much, that the current technological domination, essentially by American and Chinese businesses, prevents a significant threat to national sovereignty on multiple fronts. And in my reply to George, I mentioned essentially two of the many. First, these businesses are going to know everything there is to know about their citizens. Indeed, they're going to know more about their citizens than anybody else knows, which is quite a big deal, to put it very mildly, in terms of national autonomy. And secondly, there are a whole host of essential services that will end up being run by these businesses. And Seda, I think, gave some very important examples of precisely that. Indeed, one can't think of a more important example than she gave. But I've become aware of an interesting other one, which is more in my area, which is the development of digital currencies. It seems very plausible, almost certain, in fact, that in most countries in the world, digital currencies will not emerge without, at the very least, the help, if not the total domination of platform monopolies. And there is really nothing more central to a country than the running of its currency and payment system. So this is just a couple of examples. And I think this gets at an absolutely central question, which is, what does national sovereignty mean in this world? And if you don't have national sovereignty, democracy is meaningless. So that very briefly will be my current viewpoint.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks you. I didn't see your reply, so that's why I asked. There's most of the questions to Nuria have been replied directly, and thanks to Nuria for doing this. There are two questions to Seda. One from John Beckett: how much is planned by tech companies responsible for human consequences, for example, in the mines in Africa, and what can be done about this? And then there is a question from George also. There's a comment from Paul, and there's a question from George. How is it possible for governments to ask social media and other tech companies to define the limits of free speech themselves without instituting a mechanism for external supervision, an ombudsman or public authorities? I think this is a question not to Seda alone, this is for everybody. So I'm going to ask first I'll ask Seda to reply to the first question, and then I'll make a tour of the table with the speakers to have a final comment, and everybody can also reply to this if they want to. Seda, there you are.
All right, so I think that's a wonderful question. And I have to say that I've been working with Marta Poon on these questions. She studies history of finance, and also Miriam Arak and Helen Pritchard and Femke Snelting, who have a much historical view of how dependencies have been created that produce the supply chains that we have today. So what a lot of our work runs into is that we're in the process of describing the problem rather than coming up with solutions. And I think this is kind of my overall answer to, can we just regulate these companies? I can say it's very difficult to regulate these companies if we don't have the right frame. Currently, our frames are either dominated by surveillance capitalism, which focuses on data and behavioral manipulation, which is an important topic. But what I tried to show you is that institutional and infrastructural takeover requires a broader frame than we have. The other one is through markets, that it would break certain market mechanisms like competition. And I'm not sure that that would solve, for example, the issues that we have here with respect to what happens with very long tradition coming from colonial times until today of supply chains and extractivism with irresponsible mining in the global south so that we can have shiny objects in the global north. So I wish I had an answer for this that was like, okay, here's how we're going to decolonize. But I think, yes, I agree with you that there are two things that are really important to highlight. Obsolescence of tech is really a thing. The other thing is cloud. The cloud is a huge energy churner, and and the whole services thing is about continuous updating, and there's no intention to think about both the supply chains and the kind of global impact of these infrastructures on our world. And I think that is one of the main questions we should be looking at, again, showing that we need to go beyond the framing of competition and surveillance capitalism that is currently dominant.
Very good, thank you very much. Tom, last word. I was looking, when you spoke, we said the future is not decided yet, but can we, each of us, maybe each of the speakers, come back to what is it that we should be influencing to be taken forward to influence that future in the better direction? Tom.
So I suppose my words on this connect with the final question in the chat about, can we get social media companies to regulate themselves, free speech? And for me, it speaks to this misunderstanding of what freedom itself means, which is essential to our understanding of what democracy will be for us, which is there is this increasingly distorted notion that freedom is the absence of any regulation. And that completely ignores the fact that without some regulation, power asymmetries, domination by different actors is inevitable. And what we need is not the absence of regulation, but the right type of regulation from the right sort of suite of actors. And I think that sort of relates to the pandemic response, it relates to tech, it relates to free speech, and it relates to democracy itself. So that's what I would like to leave as our final thought from me.
Thanks a lot. This is very, very interesting. Wieslaw, you? Where are you? There. Okay.
I am. Yeah, from my perspective, it's very important to democratize technology design and prototyping. This can be kind of extension of do-it-yourself movement. So bottom-up way of making things, and also bringing to the table artists and designers and people who think in different way than typically startups or people very deeply connected with technological progress. So I have a lot of this kind of experience that even artists or designers who program computers first time in their life, making more, how to say, something which wonder me. I am computer scientist and I can't write the program so great and so so different than these people do. So power to the people who are thinking differently and kind of how to say showing that the technology can be developed also by people who think we are humanists and this is not for us. So we have to encourage this kind of people to be a part of this process of developing the way we shape technology and the way we think about our future, which is very deeply connected with the technology development.
Okay, thank you very much. The human side, the human values and creativity come back into the process. Nuria.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will have 4 points that are kind of like all interrelated. I think the first one is a call to action. I think all of us, both as citizens, but also as professionals, we need to think of how we can contribute to the necessary change. We do need to use technology for positive social change. We need to understand that we won't be able to tackle the challenges that have been mentioned before, climate change, the aging of the population, inequality, lack of resources, pandemics, without the help of technology. But not every technological development entails progress. And what we really need to fight for and invest is in technology that means progress. And that's why my first message is a call to action. Let us all, as citizens, but also in our respective professions, demand the investments necessary to have technological development that really means progress. And to me, this means ensuring that the quality of life of all people, is increased together with the rest of biological beings on the planet and our planet itself. So to do that, we need to make sure that we deploy data and technology that is fit for purpose and that always has a humanity-centric perspective, that is inclusive and that is not increasing the existing gaps, but decreasing them. We need to place people at the center and in the loop. And to me, there is no other way. I mean, there are many tools that we can use, like large-scale public consultations, critical governance, accountability mechanisms, local forums, but also we need regulation. I think regulation is absolutely necessary. I do not believe in self-regulation. Self-regulation means no regulation from my perspective. And then finally, we need to very massively invest in education. We need to educate at all levels. We need to transform our compulsory education systems, but also education to professionals that are being expelled out of the system with upskilling and reskilling programs, and education to citizens and to public decision makers. I've realized how little data literate public administrators are and public policy makers, and how necessary it is that we invest in education at all levels. And this is not a short-term solution, education, so I think we need to start acting now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuria. Seda, and then Martin.
All right, great, thanks. I think, oh God, how are we going to do this? Sorry, I was responding to the chat at the same time. So I think it is very clear from some of the studies of political economy of current computational infrastructures that they want to hollow out institutions using their services, and they want to propose a sort of optimization of our existing infrastructures, which means that they're not only influencing human behavior, but also the environment that we live in, be it cities or the nature that we depend on for the health of our societies. So I think it's very important to empower our institutions to be prepared for what is to come. I think what the COVID contact tracing showed us is that we're not really ready, but I think we can learn, and there's a great possibility to think about how can we transform our institutions that have also been accused of failing our democracies and processes and constituents to make up for their failings without throwing them at the tech companies. This means when we decide to use technology in these institutions, we have to think about, does this setup of technology throw them in the hands of the computational infrastructures we have, or does it serve the people they're supposed to serve? And I think that's the main question that I would give for you. How do you make the institutions so that they transform to serve the people, kind of like what Nuria was saying, but in a way that we don't set them up technologically to just be ushered into current day computational infrastructures, which I think is not the solution.
Thank you. Martin, last word.
Okay, I just want to focus on one question, which, because I think it's the most important to me, because it gets to everything, which is, I think, from George, how can we ask social media and other tech companies to define the limits of free speech themselves? And the answer, and I've just been writing about this in my book, is we can't. We can't. But we have. Now, this is not a subject that I can develop very far in my book, but I've been thinking about, because I'm interested mainly in history. Back in the very turn of the last century, there was a very important movement in the United States, the antitrust movement, which was really the first time in history that a major power tried to control the tendency towards monopoly being generated by the emergence of the corporate sector as the dominant system for organizing the economy, which was itself obviously novel. I won't go further in the history. And that led to antitrust policy, competition policy, and that became a very, very important feature of the social market idea in Germany, which then got embedded in the EU's competition rules. I think we're at an even more pregnant and central issue in terms of corporate power, far more than even the Rockefeller Trust created, by the absolute centrality of tech companies, and a very limited number of them, to everything done in the world, including, as I indicated before, the operation of our entire economic and political systems. So this needs, I think, a fundamental rethink of government relationships with these businesses. And that involves at least two challenges, one of which I can't comment on, but which others of this audience have been talking about, which is a tech one, which is how the hell do governments understand what these businesses are doing and how they operate, and how therefore can they operate effectively as regulators at all? And my impression is it's nigh on impossible. But the second one is the political one I mentioned. These aren't the companies of the world. They're the companies of two countries, basically, operating in the world. And we're in the middle of a war between these two countries, not yet physical. So how do you regulate those businesses effectively when they're not yours? It's really hard. The only way that any country has so far found to do this is the Chinese way, which is a complete firewall, giving them a monopoly to their businesses, which are under their state's control. We don't want to go that way. The Americans don't want us to control and regulate their businesses. So in addition to being a colossal political technological problem, it is a stupendous political problem at a geopolitical level. And I don't think, my impression is absolutely nobody in Europe is thinking about this at that level as an expression of your ability to have sovereign independence of any kind from these entities. This is a new perception to me, but I think it is the biggest political and economic challenge going at the moment, apart, of course, from preserving some sort of democracy and avoiding catastrophic climate change and a few others we've all been talking about. But it's a really big deal, and I don't think we have begun to think about the political dimensions of this issue.
Thank you, Martin, for a very, very thinking piece to continue this debate and this discussion. I think I can talk for the Digital Enlightenment. I think we have been engaged in talking about this and further thinking about this in the future. So you will all be informed about further activities in this area. I think first we need to really take stock on the very valuable inputs that you've all provided. Thank you for all of the speakers, for participating, for being there, even with competing agendas or even with late night agendas like Tom. I appreciate very much that you stayed online, also for Martin and everybody else. Thank you for the attendees. for your comments. I hope that most of your comments have been responded to in the chat room. Thanks for the speakers also to respond in the chat room, so that with addresses and information and so on. And I have to close 10 minutes late here. Good evening to everybody, and see you soon again. Bye.
Ciao. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.